In his book, Band of Brothers, historian Stephen Ambrose describes the exploits of the 101st Airborne Regiment in the European theater in World War II. And the book begins with Ambrose's description of the selection and rigorous training process required to become a paratrooper. Surprisingly, at least to me, the invitation to be a paratrooper was actually wide open in these days, early days of World War II. They didn't have aptitude tests to identify recruits, for various jobs within the military back then. Basically, at the end of basic, they said, who wants to be in the artillery? And some guys would raise their hand, okay, and who wants to be in the armor? And so different guys would say, oh, I'll be in the tank corps. And then somebody came out and said, who wants to be in the airborne? And now you have to remember, this is 1941. And they're like, what's the airborne? Oh, so you're going to be a paratrooper. What's a paratrooper? Oh, this is great. You're going to get into an airplane, and we're going to fly you over enemy lines, and you're going to jump out of that airplane behind enemy lines and fight from there. Go to hell. That's right. That's what most of us. Man. Let the crazy guys do that, right? But the offer was on the table, right? It was basically everybody who graduated from basic got an invitation. Now, all those who did answer that call were put through rigorous physical training and to form their units and to develop the camaraderie and esprit de corps that made those elite units so effective during the war. But there was one aspect of the training that absolutely was required of all who would be a paratrooper. And it was the part of the training that came at the very end. After all that physical training and after training with weapons and developing your kind of platoon company spirit, you actually had to jump out of an airplane. That was required, funnily enough. So basically, everybody went to another base, and they would put everybody, they put a group of guys, it's called a stick, in an airplane, and the airplane would go up, and it's like light would turn from red to green, go, 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 and they tell them to jump out that door. And so the guys would start jumping out the door. Now, every once in a while, there was a guy who'd get to that door, and it was like a cat over a bathtub, like full bracing, right? Now, if that happened, that was expected. Sometimes that would happen. You would have somebody who would balk at the door. And so basically the drill instructor, unclips them from the line and has them sit back down on the seats to let the rest of the stick jump out of the airplane. And then he would go with the airplane back to base. That wasn't the end of him. They gave him another chance, and they'd send him up again with another stick. And again, light would turn green, go, go, go. And the guys would jump out of the door, and sometimes they would jump out, but sometimes they would balk again. Still, that was okay. They'd ride the airplane all the way back to the base, and they would join a third stick. This was the third and final time of asking, as we like to say. If you balked 3 times, you were done, because you actually have to jump out of an airplane to become a paratrooper, right? Now, Ambrose is fair to the guys who didn't make the jump. Right? There were some guys who didn't make it. And Ambrose does describe the combat service records of several, and many of those who didn't make the jump went on to do great things and even heroic exploits in other infantry units. They landed on D-Day, were awarded various ribbons for combat merit, etc. But they weren't paratroopers. Ambrose points out, in a sense, that jumping, taking the leap of faith, was absolutely required of paratroopers. Similarly, actually following Jesus, funnily enough, is required to be a disciple. Peter, Andrew, James, and John immediately left their nets and followed him. From the Gospels, there seems to be a qualitative difference between the kind of following that these 4 and the other 8 who would eventually join the 12, the kind of following that these guys did, and the tagging along of the crowd, right? Because you have the 12 disciples, and then you have the crowds. There were other people, there were plenty of people who gathered around Jesus, but did not follow him. These crowds were sometimes looking for a miracle, sometimes looking for a hero to liberate them, sometimes looking just for a loaf of bread. Often, these crowds simply formed an obstacle to those whom Jesus really did want to see. Evidently, the Gospels tell us that there is a difference between following Jesus and merely admiring him. There's a story that came to me through my seminary alumni magazine. It was an occasion where one of my theological heroes, Stanley Hauerwas, was giving an address to the seminary's convocation, and one of those getting an honorary degree, a honorary doctorate in sacred theology, was Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. It was, I think, 2002, and it's one of those things where, after there's a change of administration and people retire from service, they kind of do a victory lap in either the liberal or conservative establishment. They pick up honorary degrees and give commencement addresses at friendly institutions, that sort of thing. And so Madeleine Albright was doing that very thing at my seminary alma mater. And as part of her remarks, she was the first one to speak as someone receiving the honorary degree. And she talked about how she had just found out that her family, of course, had fled in the days of World War II from Central Europe. And she discovered that her family, when they came to America, became essentially nominal Christians, but in the old country, they were Jews. And so she had kind of discovered her Jewish roots and had explored that part of her faith and spirituality. But in her talk, she said that she'd always been fascinated by Jesus, right? And fascinated by his example. And then it came time for Stanley Hauerwas to address the student body. Now, you have to understand that Stanley, as some of his fan base call him, can be very pugnacious in public. He can be very salty. And so he got up to give his address to the convocation. You have to imagine that Secretary Albright is sitting in front of him, just like Luke is sitting in front of me right now. I mean, she's right there in front of him. And so he begins his address by saying, "Secretary Albright, I'm so pleased that you've discovered the Jewish roots of your heritage and you're exploring that spirituality. But as a Christian, I'm afraid it is my duty to tell you that Jesus does not want your fascination. He wants your obedience." That's Stanley for you, right? After all, the crowds of Jerusalem admired Jesus on Palm Sunday, only to demand his crucifixion on Friday. Indeed, the cross does seem to have something to do with actually following Jesus. Again, this is a story coming to me, again, a Stanley Hauerwas story, but this time coming to me through his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. He tells the story of Clarence Jordan, the founder of Koinonia Community. It was an interracial farm in Georgia that started in the early 50s. Just to give you a sketch of the difficulties of starting an interracial farm in Georgia in the early 50s. And as they were coming under pressure from various local governmental agencies that were trying to make life difficult for them and break up their experiment in reconciliation and racial solidarity, Clarence asked his brother, Robert Jordan, who would later become a state senator and a justice on the Georgia Supreme Court, to represent Koinonia Farm legally. His brother replied, "Clarence, I can't do that. You know my political aspirations. Why, if I represented you, I might lose my job, my house, everything I've got." "We might lose everything too, Bob. It's different for you." "Why is it different? I remember, it seems to me, that you and I joined the church the same Sunday as boys. I expect when we came forward, the preacher asked me about the same question he did you. He asked me, 'Do you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior?' And I said, 'Yes.' What did you say?" I follow Jesus, Clarence, up to a point. Could that point by any chance be the cross? That's right. I follow him to the cross, but not on the cross. I'm not getting myself crucified. Then I don't believe you're a disciple, Clarence said. You're an admirer of Jesus, but not a disciple of his. I think you ought to go back to that church you belong to and tell them you're an admirer, not a disciple. Well, now, if everyone who felt like I did that, we wouldn't have a church, would we? The question, Clarence said, is, do you have a church? When we confess that we believe in one God and his only Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, we're asserting several things. But one of the things we are asserting is that there is only one reality around which all of our lives are called to be organized, and one reality around which all of our lives, both corporately and as an individual, are called to be organized. In the Creed, we are acknowledging that Jesus does not come to us as an equal to bargain for our time and allegiance. Kind of like, if I heal this thing, or if I get you out of this jam, will you teach Sunday school for me? That's not how that goes, right? That's not how Jesus comes to us. He does not come to us as an inspiring leader asking us to volunteer in his movement. That's my job, people. Right? That's what I do. Right? I don't think I'm inspiring, but I am asking you to volunteer. Let's be clear. Rather, in the Creed, we confess that Jesus comes to us as Lord, as King, making a sovereign claim on what is his own, for he made it. As we say in that Creed, through whom all things are made. That's what we are confessing in that creed. Maybe now that you know that, you might imitate one of the bishops of the Episcopal Church who was more popular in the 80s and 90s, who said that he liked to say the creed with his fingers behind his back, right, crossed behind his back. Maybe there are parts of that assertion that you aren't willing to cotton to. When Jesus says, "Follow me," he is not just offering us something more interesting to do with our spare time. Reminds me of when I met a parishioner who I hadn't seen at church for a long time. I mean, like over a year, and not even on Christmas and Easter, okay? So, like, I hadn't seen this mother of two teenage boys. I knew she had teenage boys because they were on the print, the printout of the youth group, and we never saw them. And so I ran into her at a conference that was being done by the Klein Independent School District, where they get community people together. It was one of those things. I don't even remember what the topic was, but it was one of those meetings that you show up to. And so I was, I'm in my blacks, I'm wearing my clericals, and I see this woman across the room. And so as the meeting breaks up after the conference, as she starts heading towards the door, I kind of set my trajectory, to kind of, intersect. Oh, how funny to meet you here. Look at you, right? I'm so glad to see you. And she, of course, it's not like I said anything, but immediately the confession started, right? I mean, I swear, all I said was hello. All I said was hello. But it's like, oh, Father, I know we haven't been to church that long, that very recently, and, et cetera, et cetera. And then she said something that has always stuck with me. She said, Sunday mornings are the only time where we don't have anything. And so I wasn't like, I'm standing right here, right? I mean, you realize I'm standing right in front of you. Man, that's the kind of thing. It's just like, it gives me these. That's what started these out, those sorts of exchanges, right? Jesus does not offer us something simply more interesting to do. Rather, in following him, Jesus is seeking to repurpose our lives. Kind of like retooling a factory, right? Kind of if a factory is like it's making SUVs and then gas prices go up, it's like, uh-oh, we better make Mini Coopers now. And so they retool to make something else. It's still a car factory, but it's making a different kind of car. Gosh, if only the Bible gave us resources to understand something like this. Well, what about this? It's almost as if you took something like a sword and you took it out of its scabbard and you nailed it to a plow to help you grow your crop, right? Something like from a sword to a plowshare. It's like that. Or maybe there's something else I can think of. You know, it's like this. It's as if you took a spear, you know, that sharp, pointy thing you stab people with. If you took a spear, which is for one thing, and if you bent it and then sharpened another edge of it and then used it to prune branches off a tree or get figs off your tree with it, it's like that. Retooling, repurposing your life. So it's still your life, but it's doing something new. Or it's like taking a bunch of fishermen and turning them into fishers of men. The kind of people who can bring other people into the boat with them, with the sort of winsome compulsion, think a baited hook, with which they themselves were caught, right? Something of that nature. And following Jesus entails certain behaviors, not just affective states, right? Not just thinking Jesus is a great guy, or, boy, wouldn't it be great if all those other people followed Jesus better, you know, then the world would be such a better place, right? Following Jesus entails certain concrete behaviors. One of them is Eucharistic worship, in which one of the ways that we symbolize and concretize the journey that Jesus asks us to take following Jesus is that we actually get you to walk up these steps or to these rails. You actually get up and you walk to meet Jesus. We don't just give Jesus to you in trays with little plastic shot glasses and you can remain comfortably seated. We don't do that because we want to teach you that you actually have to follow Jesus to follow Jesus. It takes getting up and walking. Another way to follow Jesus would be to study his word in the scriptures. In a sense, kind of walking through the story, page by page, as your finger runs through that text, encountering a story in which your story finds its end. The Greeks would use the word telos, its perfect and fitting conclusion, right? The very life you're walking through, you walk with Jesus through the scriptures that you read. Finally, following Jesus entails serving somehow, some way. Just one thing, I like to say, just one thing. And it is my joy and my purpose in life. I was taken from doing one thing and kind of retooled to find my joy in helping you find that one thing to do for God's people. Right? Concrete, practical ways of serving. Jesus said he was the way. It's one of the famous passages of John's Gospel. I am the way, the truth, and the life. The Greek word for way is hodos. It means not just way, but it literally means like a road or a path, right? And you can't kind of do a path by looking at it, right? You know those motivational posters that have that path going up the mountain, and it's like, it has something inspiring at the bottom of it. Right? Like hindsight is 20/20, something like that, But walking the way isn't like looking at a picture. It means putting one foot in front of the other. Jesus is not something or even someone to be looked at or intellectually apprehended. Jesus did not come to give us a set of ideas. That was not his mission. Rather, he came to show us practically on the cross a way of suffering love. The risen Jesus is present every Sunday and every time you pray. That's why I want you to pray. It's not for my benefit. I pray. I want you to pray so that you can encounter the risen Jesus. Encounter him walking by your life every day that you live it. And as Jesus walks by your life, when you hear his call, I ask, will you make the jump? From admirer to follower, from hearer to doer, from crowd to disciple. Amen.